I got into it the hard way by having a very serious back problem. L5S1 disc herniation. It happened in my first pregnancy in the ninth month. It was horrible. And at first, people thought, oh, maybe it'll go away when the baby's born. But it didn't. It persisted and it became worse. And I was trying all sorts of things: physical therapy, massage, the conventional things, stretching, strengthening, and then the alternative things: chiropractic, acupuncture, me checking my head, yoga. And I just wasn't getting anywhere. And this was a horrible pain. It was like a pickaxe in my buttock with shooting pain all the way down to my toes. I couldn't carry my baby. I couldn't even carry a cooking pot without feeling twinges. And perhaps worst, I couldn't sleep through the night. I didn't want to take pain meds because I was nursing my baby, but I would wake up every 2 hours and I'd be in horrible spasm and I'd have to hobble around and then walk and go around the block a couple of times to get out of spasm and then go back to sleep. So there was no way to live. And I was casting around for a wider, for solutions. And I gave up finally and had surgery, L5S1 laminectomy, discectomy, which gave me relief. But I still had twinges, and within a year, I had re-herniated the same disc. And now they were offering me another surgery. So this is when you're in your mid-20s looking at multiple back surgeries, which then become, the place gets unstable. And then you're looking at fusion surgeries and the outcomes are not good. And so I was really looking at my life completely altered, like living life like a cripple, really. I couldn't do things. I couldn't carry my baby. I couldn't, yeah. So I would just kept casting a wider and wider net, looking for solutions. And the things that resonated for me were the things that harkened back to those early observations my mother had tuned me into. That there are people who are highly functional that work all day, every day without pain. And so there were some techniques that talk about that guide you into how you're using your body rather than looking for an external intervention, an adjustment or an injection or a medication. I tried all those techniques. And so the things that made most sense were about using your body differently. And Feldenkrais is one of those. They affect the neural pathways. And Alexander of Alexander technique did some research on how people move, and he mostly worked on himself with the mirror and gave himself biofeedback. And then Uplum was the most important one for me. Noel Perez was an early student of Iyengar, who was actually a family friend. So it was a small circle. And Iyengar has an amazing body, really a textbook example of everything I now teach, where he bends and how his spine is aligned and so on. And Noel Perez was an early student and learned a lot from him and learned a lot from an early French anatomist who made the observation that a J spine, well, he didn't call it a J spine, that's my coinage, but that this multiple curves throughout the back, which is accepted as the norm today, is actually flawed. He didn't point that out so much, but his depiction of the spine had more angle at L5S1, the place where I had been injured, yeah, where I had a herniated disc. So he shows the pelvis anteverted, and Noel picked that up and created work in yoga and an alternative kind of yoga approach. And then Iyengar told her, walk behind the people in the Indian marketplace. And when your shadow looks like theirs, you will have learned something. And she took that to heart and was very intuitive and did a lot of good pioneering work. So she was my most important early teacher. And her group of teachers in Paris, where I spent a year learning, was where I first learned how to implement what people in very functional societies are doing into your body. Noel, like Iyengar, was very against systematizing anything, against making a method. So, she would tell people not to even bother if you aren't going to come for 2 months or more. And people would, years into studying with her, would still get yelled at. You're falling forward. You're falling forward. There was no method. She was against. Il faut pas systématiser. You mustn't systematize anything. And so it was in bits and pieces. The classes were tiny, and there were people in there who'd come for 10 years and people who'd come for the first time, all mixed together. And I work in the US. In the US, people don't come to anything forever in a with faith and following and they want things to be more efficient, and I do too. And my background, I was trained in biochemistry at Harvard and Princeton. I have a very strong science background and inclination. Things need to be logical and efficient and effective. And, I'm always looking for that. So at the time I learned on myself, I was already a practicing acupuncturist. And so I had a ready lab. And I would, and it's common for people with back pain to come to an acupuncturist. Well, that's the most common thing we see. So in the beginning, I would tack on a little lesson, a 15-minute lesson, and teach them something. And I would see what worked. That was my beginning experiment. And what I realized early is that people are in very different mindsets when they come for acupuncture than when they come to learn something. In acupuncture, they just want to lie on your table and they want to be treated and they want to be passive and zone out. And part of the gift of acupuncture is that it's very relaxing, but you're not in a proactive learning mode. And so I early on realized I had to separate these two things. And my early students were my neighbors. I was living on Stanford campus at the time, so it was faculty, graduate students, neighbors, and friends. And so I started having little classes based on what I was sort of learning was a decent pathway. And that's what I kept tuning over the years. So early on, I designed a 6-lesson course, but the order in which you teach things was tricky to arrive at, how to make it efficient, how to make it land and stick, what metaphors to use. So, and by this time, I was doing a deep dive into the medical literature and figuring out, what actually the basis for these spinal shapes were. Is there any research? And there's precious little on spinal curves. I had to really dive deep and get help from the Stanford librarians to find research that distinguished between upper lumbar curve and lower lumbar curve, because most of the studies were just about lumbar curve, all lumped together. And when you do that, it makes it look like lumbar curve doesn't matter. And that's the basis for a lot of physical therapists saying posture has no bearing on back pain, because, and that's because they haven't looked at posture and spinal curves with enough granularity or with the right granularity. So it was very hard to find studies that actually distinguished between where your behind is, your L5S1 curve and the lower lumbar curve and the upper lumbar curve. And it turns out that what you really want for good spinal health is a lot of curve where your bottom meets your back. Your behind wants to be behind. I sometimes joke with my students. That's why it's called a behind. When people coined that phrase, they knew where this part went. Yeah. So the behind is sharply angled behind, like a baby's. Yeah. And like a Greek statues and like indigenous people. And then up above, there's really not much curve. So coined this phrase J spine to describe this shape, to contrast it with an S spine, which in modern times we have mistakenly come to believe is the right spinal shape. So this is a really important teaching. How do you arrive at a J spine instead of an S spine or a C spine for people who have been slumping and slouching? That's usually what shows up. And then the people who've been trying to have good posture kind of stick out their chest, sit up straight, stand up straight, and end up with these exaggerated curves. So my problem is, how do you get people safely from where they're at, whether a C spine or an S spine or a melted into yourself I spine? That's another variation you see usually in older people. And how do you get these people to having a lengthened, reshaped J spine? How do you do that safely, no matter where people are coming from with their herniated discs or bulging discs or inflammations? And so that was a matter of experimentation. What metaphors, what language do you use? And what I arrived at is you first want to elongate the spine. It's kind of like preparing the clay when you're going to change the shape of a piece of clay and make a pot. You don't just go pushing clay around. That pot was going to break. You first have to massage the clay, and the equivalent in the human body is you have to prepare the muscles and create enough space that your later remodeling can be safe and effective, that it's going to feel good, it's going to look good, and it's going to be good. Um, so those kind of insights were slow and difficult to arrive at, because if you begin at the wrong place, you can have a lot of flare-ups and there are people who talk about no pain, no gain, and you have to work through the pain, and I don't believe in that. Pain was arrived at after millions of years of evolution. Nature designed pain to tell us, hey, stop. This isn't working. And so I teach people to not just glibly ignore that and proceed along. It's called Gokhale method because early on I had students who were, the CEOs of Silicon Valley companies and venture capitalists and, people who are very business savvy. And I certainly wasn't. And I had several people advise me early on that I should give it my name, Gokhale Method, because it cuts the marketing dollars in half. Anytime I'm speaking about the method, the name is there already. I don't have to additionally promote the name. So I believed them. And I also made the observation that every method that doesn't have someone's name on it dies at the end of their life. It doesn't persist. And I realized early on that this method is really special. It's actually a solution to most people's back pain. And back pain is not a rare event. It's the number one cause of global disability. So I realized that I have a jewel in my possession. It has been bequeathed to me, and I need to take good care of it and honor it and nurture it and bring it to the public. I needed to come up with techniques that apply universally. No, we have in our classes, we have a mix of people, ages, fitness levels, genders, and what we've come at is something that really works well for everybody. Um, and that was a little difficult to arrive at because some people are auditory learners, some people are more visual learners, some people are more intellectual learners. Not so very many people are particularly good at kinesthetic learning. And that, of course, it needs to be in the mix. So we arrived at a very rich weave of showing images at the same time as there's either hands-on guidance or verbal guidance, because recently we've discovered this can be taught online very effectively, to my surprise. That I can tell you about that later. But we really tried to teach and using multiple channels so that it lands for all kinds of learners. And another thing that got arrived at over the years is metaphors that actually work. So, for example, the sit up straight or stand up straight or make yourself extra tall direction usually results in people arching. They kind of stick out their chest and they arch their back. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. We're trying to help them elongate their back. And in their attempt to have good posture, most people shorten their back by arching. And so we have many ways of directing people on how to truly add length into their spine and then pick it up with their deep abdominal and deep back muscles to maintain that extra length. So, for example, we have a technique where you can push with your hands on your hips, and push the top of your body away from the bottom of your body. And imagine that you're sort of coming up and around a bar at chest height to prevent arching back. But that's a complex metaphor, right? It's a complex image to describe. And so somewhere along the way, one of our teachers actually came up with a metaphor that works like a charm. She's from Wisconsin, Doreen, and that's a cold place. And so she came up with imagine that you are walking into cold water, a cold lake or a cold ocean, and the water is creeping up, 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 and you're trying to escape the cold water. And that arrives you at very similar combination of muscle contractions. It makes you thinner and taller because you're escaping that cold water. And students get this immediately. It's an experience most people have had. And so that was an improved metaphor, an improved image. And so we have a lot of these that really evoke a, a accurate body response that takes them in the right direction. And so, it's quite a collection of these that help people step by step resculpt, re-architect their spines and their bodies and learn to move differently, learn to bend differently, walk differently. It's all about being pain-free. It was quite a painful experience, actually, because writing does not come easily to me or used not to. And so it was mostly in my head bouncing around, I would say for 10 years, thinking, I need to write this down. And I was raising 3 children, thanks to getting rid of my own back pain, I was able to have 2 more children. So that occupies a lot of your time. And so I didn't have much time. But when my youngest was out of the like about, yeah, 10 years old, I got together with a friend of mine who also had a book in her head, bouncing around for 10 years. Very different book. She was thinking of a novel in verse. Mine was how to get out of back pain. Couldn't be more different. But we're good friends, and we arranged to get together once a week and report on our progress each week, and then make a commitment about what we were going to do for the next week. It was mostly a time commitment, but also a subject, like what we would work on. And so I had a schedule, which I kept to quite strictly, early morning hours. And and then I knew what I was supposed to do. I would always start with journaling just to get the flow going. And then pretty soon it would converge on my subject of interest, I would say obsession. My mind wanders to posture in everything. When I go to a museum, I see objects of art through this filter. When I travel, when I look around. So it's easy for me to converge on posture. And so after journaling a bit, it would be my work on the next chapter. And so that's how the writing got done. And then I had a student who felt very strongly about the value of this work and was a professional editor in her past, retired, and offered to help me edit the book. And we did it together. We would get together twice a week and massage every sentence. So it was line by line, both of us, and we brought it into some kind of structure. Now, I had a vision of a kind of scrapbook, which is what the book has become, where there would be multiple ways of going through it. You could, if you all you wanted was the step-by-step instructions, you could read the book that way. But on every page, there's a sidebar with anthropological reference, with photographs from my field work, because I had begun early on to travel to places to deepen my observations and learn new truths about human movement, from people who don't have pain. So there were a lot of photographs I collected and graphics to amplify some concepts. So that's all in the sidebars.